I have done a lot of author interactions in the past, but today I'm stuck about introducing a special guest. How do you introduce someone with words who knows more words than they are in the English dictionary? An Indian politician who gave it back to the Brits in their own backyard in 2015 at House of Commons. The only politician who has done a stand-up comedy act outside the parliament. A logophile, hyper-literate, a word buff, vocab builder, verbivore, or simply Dr. Shashi Tharoor. This session is curated by Rajat. We have Mr. Jyoti Kamal, the executive editor at TV18 Broadcast Limited, in conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy one of the many meaningful conversations hosted through the kaleidoscope of beautiful and timely books.
Okay. So as I was saying that, Dr. Tharoor, you are the kind of person who kind of gets people prepping without you knowing it, that you have got people to kind of start prepping. You get them preening, get them pruning. And then there was this one word that was there in your book, Tharooorosaurus, out of the 53 words that are there, which is floxy, noxy, pillification. That's the kind of feeling that you leave a lot many people with in terms of, the kind of impact that you have on them. I know people will have to actually kind of read the book to figure out what that particular word means. But how do you kind of react to the often quoted thing that where you are, people do kind of tend to become a little more aware about their English, a little more aware of their pronunciation, kind of, and especially if you kind of look at Punjab, the kind of gravity that is there on different words, the Punjabi that is there. So do you kind of sense that people actually start worrying about their English a little bit more in your presence?
Well, the wicked old joke about Punjab was supposed to be that everyone's English improves after 8 p.m. But that's another story. As far as I'm concerned, look, the whole thing is a bit of a joke because I didn't particularly. I'm proud of the fact that I read widely, I've acquired a fairly extensive vocabulary, and I use it, I hope, as appropriate. But because I do want to communicate my message to those I speak to, I honestly do not go out of my way to use words people don't understand. That's kind of a canard that has been strung around my neck, largely by my political critics. The truth is, words are a means, a vehicle, if you like, for ideas, for your feelings to reach another person or another audience. And therefore, you must use words that other people can understand and relate to. But ideally, they should be the most appropriate words to convey the ideas that you want to express. Now, in my case, sometimes because I am choosing from a fairly extensive variety of words, I may once in a while use a word that isn't as familiar with other people as I thought it was. And then the sudden result is some jokes about what does my tweet mean or my remark mean or whatever. Now, I should say this to all of you with a great deal of respect, that I think most human beings in India who function in the English language, either professionally at work or in some cases at home because of their schooling in English, they have a perfectly adequate vocabulary. And if somebody uses an unfamiliar word, there's no harm in either looking it up or saying, hey, what did you mean? But when it became kind of a big joke on Twitter, I remember it happened when I lashed out at a particularly obnoxious journalist who is once again in the news these days for his law breaking. This chap had really broadcast a lot of lies about me. So I openly said this entire broadcast was a farrago of misrepresentations, distortions, and outright lies by a television showman masquerading as a journalist. Now, I didn't realize that farrago was an unfamiliar word, that misrepresentation was an unfamiliar word, that masquerading was an unfamiliar word. And suddenly we had all these tweets coming back at me. And the funniest one was when the Oxford English Dictionary tweeted that there had suddenly been a spike of over 1 million hits from India searching for the meaning of farrago. And they were asking, why did this happen? So, well, I'm the reason why it happened. And it became a bit of a joke. And then I said, TK, people are going to tease me for this. And you remember people opening Twitter accounts, calling themselves Mr. Farrago and all sorts of things. I said, all right, if that's the case, then rather than be resentful or object every time, let's just embrace it. So what I did was, you remember a certain chief minister who had been elected on a platform with us, abandoned us and switched to the other side. So I just tweeted, word of the day, snollygoster, first used 1845 in the US, meaning a shrewd and unprincipled politician, latest use in India today. I didn't mention his state. I didn't mention his name. I didn't mention the story. I didn't attach a news clipping. Everyone knew what I was talking about. So I realized that words can become a way of actually an additional arrow in my quiver, another way of sort of, pulling people's legs or making a point. And that's why the word you referred to, Jyoti, when my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, had to be announced, I thought no point like every author just announcing I've got a new book coming out. I said, let me make people talk about it. So I tweeted, my new book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is more than just a 500-page exercise in floxinosi nihilipilification. But then I also gave the meaning, which meant the act of estimating as worthless, estimating someone or something as worthless. I'm trying to say this is not just a book saying Modi is worthless. It's much more in-depth and serious than that. Now, it did have the desired effect. A lot of people started looking up the word, and in the process, a lot of people got to know about my book. And even the internet jokes about that word helped my book. What I have to bear the cross for after that is all these poor little kids, sometimes as young as 4 or 5 years old, who are forced by their parents to learn the word floxinosi nihilipilification. But that's part of the price of doing these things in India.
That's in fact the longest word that's there in Tharooorosaurus. And I mean, there are a number of other interesting words. There is also the word prepone that had got you kind of thinking for a little while that perhaps you are the one who kind of invented that word, or rather coined that particular usage. But you eventually figured out when Oxford actually got back and said that there have been earlier usages of that word.
That's right.
Yeah, but something that I would like to kind of ask you is, are there actually words that you have managed to kind of come up with that you have used more often than once, which in a way are words that you have created? Because it would be a travesty, or it would be a tragedy if you hadn't coined up a few more words. So are there any words that you have kind of actually thought up?
Maybe we should leave that for a future aspiration. At the moment now, I just use words I already know. And I have to admit that that prepone was one I didn't already know. When I used it, I genuinely thought I thought of it first. I used it, I remember, in an article in the JS magazine for youth back in the early 70s, in 72, after visiting there was a big fair in Asia fair or something in Delhi. And I wrote a tongue-in-cheek article. I used the word prepone. And I found in the course of the next few years that I was in Delhi, the word was being used here and there. And then while I was away with the UN working abroad and so on, I began noticing that it had acquired a certain regularity in Indian usage. And so I thought, hey, I started something here. Of course, it turned out I didn't start it. It had existed before, but all I did really was give it a bit of currency, which is true of Farrago as well. Farrago has been around for centuries. But because I used it, and for some reason, it is a word I used in my debates at St. Stephen's College to attack the other side, that their arguments were a Farrago of misrepresentations or illogicalities or whatever. So I'd used the word before, but it never really caught on, I gather. So when I use it this time, it's come back into circulation. Now people use it. Similarly, interlocutor, which again, I didn't invent. It's a very common word in international diplomacy. Right now, it simply means the person you're talking with. So right now, Jyoti, you are my interlocutor and I'm yours. So that's all. But when I used it, and that certain filthy journalist decided to attack me for undermining foreign policy when I said that Saudi Arabia is our interlocutor, all I meant is we're talking to them. And this fellow reported that I had wanted Saudi Arabia to be an intermediary, which is not what it means at all. Anyway, to cut a long story short, that too then came back into usage in India because of my usage of it. And amusingly enough, when the government sent some people to Kashmir to talk to the Kashmiris and gauge their opinions, they call them their interlocutors. So you see that in some ways I can claim credit for putting some words into public circulation, but I will not seek credit for having invented any of them. They all existed before I used them.
It's actually an interesting thought exercise that when you try to think of anything, if there are not words to think with, how would you think really? I mean, can
Exactly.
you think without words? So perhaps that's what kind of sets us apart as humans, that you actually start putting and inserting words as you kind of scan the environment around you. It's a constant barrage of words coming in. So in fact, I was reading up on you, and your father always also made the same kind of a correlation, that the more the words that you know, the better you'll be able to think, because you'll have more concepts to kind of wrap your mind around.
Exactly.
But something that people find really interesting, and they do not perhaps know, is that the accent that is often associated with you is not something that you picked up outside of India, as you have claimed. As you say, in fact, that you actually picked it up within the country. But that is
Exactly.
something that people find very hard to believe, that your accent is actually acquired within India. It's not outside of India.
Now, I know so many Indians who talk. First of all, I have to say that this was the English we were taught at school. I went to school in Campion, Bombay, then St. Xavier's, Calcutta, then, of course, college in St. Stephen's, Delhi. And I must say that in many of these places, the kind of English that was spoken by the teachers is the English I speak today. I just happened to have a good year and I picked it up. It also helped that my parents were displaced Keralites. So they were not living in their home state where their mother tongue might have predominated, might have dominated our life at home. So there we were, speaking English all day in school, picking up Hindi, or in Bombay's case, Bombay Hindi, on the streets and with friends. And therefore, the principal language of communication, the language in which we dreamt and quarreled and wooed and fought, was English. And so it became our first language. Now, my sisters don't sound any different from me. Many of my classmates don't sound any different from me. And many of my seniors certainly don't sound different from me. I mean, I can name a number of them at St. Stephen's and at St. Xavier's who spoke, if you like, in an even more English sounding accent, because mine is not totally English. I know that because I can put on an English accent for fun if I want to. When I read from my novel, The Great Indian Novel, I enjoy caricaturing an English character's accent by speaking like him. So the point is that there is a difference, but this was the English that the educated English-speaking Indian was supposed to speak like, and we were taught it by teachers who had learned it, of course, when the British were still around, who had learned it from the British when they were kids. I went to school from the early 60s onwards. And in those days, many of our teachers had grown up in British India or had studied under British teachers. So that was the English they taught us to teach, taught us to hear and repeat. Now, today I can tell you that obviously the story is very different because an Indian accent, or very many Indian accents. Actually, there's a difference between the Punjabi English accent, the Malayali English accent, the Bengali English accent, and so on. Many Indian accents have been allowed to flourish. And because the language is spoken by larger numbers of people who are influenced by their first language, then naturally this comes in as well. But I have only one respectful thing to say to people who think that I'm sort of pretending. I can't help it. This is the way I speak. I can make a real effort and Indianize the pronunciation of some words. But it would be an effort. If I'm speaking naturally, this is the way I speak as I'm speaking to you. Now, I should stress that if they don't like it, that's fine, because just think of an Indian English accent, my accent, as one more Indian English accent, like the Punjabi English and the English, Malayalam English and the Bengali English and so on. Just think of it as one more Indian accent.
In fact, I mean, you have been a career United Nations official, and as one was going through the battle of belonging, as one reads the book, one sees that you have had massive exposure because of the fact that you were a career United Nations official, and you could actually sense and see so many different kinds of belonging that were there, whether it was in Poland, whether it was in Germany, whether it was a reunification, whether it is Europe, whether it's Africa. So you could actually have a really kind of a top-down view of what was going on. Did that in a way sort of define how you started thinking about belonging and how you started thinking about how people belong in different ways to different kind of areas? And just to take off from there, if we try to kind of atomize belonging and bring it down to its lowest or the smallest constitution bit of belonging, what is it? Is it the individual, where we start from? Because individuals are prone to kind of figuring out whether they belong to something, what side do they want to belong to? Does it begin from there? Is that the smallest common denominator of belonging, the individual?
Right. I mean, I think that's a very good, thoughtful question. In my own case, actually, the answer was yes, because I began thinking about belonging with my own story. I mean, I happened to be born in London. My parents moved to India when I was 2.5 years old. And therefore, when I grew up in India, I identified totally with India, with the India I knew and grew up with in Mumbai or Bombay as it was. And then when I was going on a scholarship to study in the US, and I wanted to stop in England and visit friends and family, and I went to apply for a visa, I was summoned by the British Deputy High Commissioner and told, hey, you're entitled to a passport. And I said, I don't want a passport. He said, well, by birth, your birth certificate is valid. You are eligible for a British passport. And he seemed mildly surprised that an Indian wouldn't leap at the opportunity. But I said, no, thank you very much. I look at the mirror and I see an Indian. I want to remain Indian, so give me a visa. And he said, well, I can't give you a visa because we don't give visas to Indians. In any case, we're not entitled to give a visa to somebody who's entitled to a passport. So you just go there, show that you were born in London, they'll let you in without even stamping your passport. And that's exactly what happened. So from that moment onwards, I began asking myself, what does belonging mean? Why is it so important to me to be Indian? What does my Indianness connote? I've been thinking about literally, I was 19 years old when that incident happened. I'm now of somewhat advanced years as a respectable senior citizen, if not always a respected one. And the truth is that it's an issue that's engaged me for a long time. But it came to take shape in a book form precisely because of my political engagement with recent Indian politics, in which for the last 6 years, we have a government that appears to be redefining the nature of India that you must belong to, and telling people like me that things I say or the stands I take are anti-national. And I asked myself, how can I, who has spurned a coveted foreign passport, coveted by many others, in order to come and serve my country, who gave up a very lucrative life, a very comfortable life in the Western world, to come and plunge into the nitty-gritty and the heat and the dust of Indian politics? How can somebody like me be anti-national? Am I not just merely advancing my own idea of my nationalism? And so I began looking into all this, and because I'm a bit of I suppose, a wonk, I started reading up on the theory, the concept, the evolution of nationalism worldwide, first of all. I've summarized that in the first 100 pages of my new book, The Battle of Belonging. And then I went into what our nationalism was. We started off as a classic anti-colonial nationalism. You Brits are foreigners, we are Indians, get out of our country. I'm simplifying it crudely just to make the point that it was anti-colonial with trappings of ethnicity. But then over 3 years of debates in the Constituent Assembly, our founding fathers and mothers decided that the kind of nationalism India would embody would actually reject the kind of logic of ethnic nationalism, would reject the religious nationalism of Pakistan that claimed that Muslims were a different nation. Somebody even raised the issue in the Constituent Assembly and said, since Pakistan has been created as a nation for Muslims, shouldn't we be a nation for Hindus? And there was a lively and vigorous debate. And they said, no, our freedom struggle has been for everybody, and we must establish a country where everybody enjoys the same rights and is equal. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Jew, Parsi, it shouldn't matter. And that belief is what animated what I call the civic nationalism enshrined in our constitution. Now, this civic nationalism means that everyone is free to practice their own religion or not, if they're as they wish. They're free to advocate and propagate their own faith. They're free to express their own ideas as they wish. And they are free in every respect to consider themselves equal with any other Indian in everything. For example, in Pakistan, you cannot be the head of the government or the head of state without being a Muslim. In India, there is no such requirement. So we can have a Sikh prime minister, we can have a Hindu prime minister. Tomorrow, in theory, we can have a Muslim prime minister. It's perfectly justified by the constitution. So when suddenly one set of people come to power and they start saying, no, India is basically a Hindu country. Hindus have the first claim on this country. Everybody else is essentially here as a guest. They are, or as a bandit, as an interloper, as an invader. By doing that, they are essentially challenging the fundaments of what the Indian constitution enshrines as Indian nationhood. Should a Hindu have a greater sense of belonging, that we belong to this country and this country belongs to us, than a Christian or than a Jew or than a Parsi? My answer is the same answer as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. Ambedkar, and all the founding fathers. No, everyone will not be defined by their language, their caste, their religion, their place of birth. If they're Indian, they're equal. And they have the same rights as I have and you have and Narendra Modi has. That idea, I believe, is worth fighting for. So my book, The Battle of Belonging, is a detailed exposition of that concept, that idea, plus a summary of the Hindutva argument, because we should know what their argument is, plus a refutation, looking at some of the recent incidents in our contemporary politics, and a request to the public to fight for and preserve this very precious sense of belonging that our founding fathers bequeathed us. If we lose out to this much narrower definition of Indianness, it will no longer be the India that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free. That's my message.
Dr. Tharoor, in fact, you just mentioned that you kind of got into the rough and tumble of Indian politics and you decided to kind of give up on a lucrative options that you could possibly have had. 2007 is when you were in the race for being the Secretary General of the United Nations, and Ban Ki-moon eventually became the Secretary General. And as you kind of mentioned that you thought that China is going to be a hurdle, but it turned out that it was basically being America getting on somebody's side that would have really kind of clinched the deal there. But nonetheless, just to kind of take you back in time, to take you forward from there, had you become the Secretary General of the United Nations, how would it have changed your worldview? Would you have ever then thought of kind of, how would you have seen the rough and tumble of Indian politics? What would it have been like? Going back and then looking forward in a direction that hasn't been in this universe, maybe in a parallel universe, but how would it have been?
Well, to be honest, I think after being Secretary General, it would have been difficult to come and enter political contention, take sides. And so when you've been in that kind of position where you constantly are only taking the global interest in mind and speaking from that vantage point, I think it honestly would have been a different set of, shall we say, options that would have confronted me. I would probably have done what the man I admired in that job, Kofi Annan, did, which was to start a foundation, promote certain good causes, take on certain honorary positions. He, for example, was involved in a foundation on African development, another one recognizing the best African leaders every year, a third one, a temporary assignment mediating the aftermath of the Kenyan election, which created a near civil war situation in that country. You can imagine that kind of global thing. And that would have probably been the life that would have awaited me. Even if I were to park myself in India, that would only have been a base. The world would have had to remain my stage. Now, there have been minor exceptions. Javier Perez de Cuellar, who was Secretary General when I moved to New York from Geneva, he went on to become Prime Minister of Peru. His predecessor, Kurt Waldheim, who was Secretary General when I started my UN career, became President of Austria, but that's a purely honorific position like our president. Ban Ki-moon, the person who defeated me for Secretary General, was a candidate for President of South Korea, but an unsuccessful candidate. So there are people who've gone back into national politics. I can never say that it was impossible for it to happen, but let's say the more natural option would have been what I saw Kofi Annan following.
In fact, as I was going through your book, I was seeing the kind of depth that goes into each page. I mean, if one had to kind of get into the mind of Dr. Shashi Tharoor in terms of the kind of knowledge that's condensed into each page, to kind of read each page and to absorb it would take a certain amount of time. For you to actually think of those concepts, then get your thoughts together and then put pen to paper and actually start kind of writing it out. I mean, it's actually mind-boggling that how do you manage to kind of put all of these tomes rather together? So if somebody had to get into the mind of Dr. Shashi Tharoor, how does it really work for you? I mean, how do the thoughts come? Then how does the research happen? Then how does it kind of turn out into these coherent thought flows with this intense amount of research that goes into it? How does it work for you?
Because, well, you know, to me, writing, I have to admit, comes as naturally to me as walking or speaking. I mean, it's a natural form of self-expression. Partly because as a small kid, I was asthmatic. Those were the days before inhalers and nebulizers and all those modern conveniences. So it was a tough life. You took a very hard pill that helped you breathe, opened up your bronchoids, but also made your heart go tuck, 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 tuck at express speed, didn't let you sleep or rest or anything. I would be sitting up often into the wee hours, sometimes the whole night, trying to stay awake. So essentially, what could I do? All I could do was read. And reading then became my escape, my education, and my entertainment all in one. Then when I ran out of books to read, because I was the eldest kid in the family, so I had no elder brothers and sisters to borrow from, I read whatever of my parents' books I could understand, which may explain why I became known as a bit precocious as a child. When I ran out of things, I said, well, if I can't read anything, let me write. So from the age of 6, I started writing stories, very imitative and derivative of the kinds of things I was reading as a child. If you are a parent, have given or read Enid Blyton books with your children, then you know what I'm talking about. She had her famous 5 and her secret 7 and so on. And I had my 6 solvers, who were a bunch of Indian kids who would go off to a village in Kerala, the way I was dragged off to a village in Kerala by my parents, and solve mysteries very much like the Enid Blyton mysteries. And I must say that I wish I wish an ex-wife hadn't thrown away the manuscripts. It might have been fun to see later in life if the stories were any good. But anyway, that's how I began writing. And so, because my father encouraged it, took me seriously, got the stories typed up by his secretary so I could show them to friends and so on, I began believing in myself as a writer, and I kept writing all the time. And then when I was 10 years old, one of my short stories was published in a Sunday edition of a Bombay newspaper. Then a so-called novel I wrote, which really wasn't a novel, it was a novella, I suppose, based on the Biggles books of Captain W.E. John. I mean, not based on, but stolen the concept from it. I had an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot in World War II, rather like the famous Biggles of those books. And this guy, his adventures were serialized in what was then called the Junior Statesman, starting a week before my 11th birthday. And I can tell you, when you first see your name in print, it's as addictive as the first bite of chocolate or the first kiss or whatever else you feel addicted to, because you keep wanting to do it over and over again. And I kept writing throughout my days. I would come back from school, finish my homework, and write an article for a magazine or newspaper. When I left for America to graduate school in 1975, at the age of 19, I can tell you that at that point, I had probably appeared in every single English language publication in India, including Chandamama and Eve's Weekly. I mean, I had been published everywhere, either short stories, fiction, or non-fiction, or even campus journalism, anything. And I was often asked by editors to write pieces for them, particularly by JS and by Eve's Weekly. For some reason, those two editors were very fond of me. But I also appeared in their rivals, Femina and Youth Times, and so on. So, I mean, I illustrated weekly, you name it. There were so many magazines in those days. First of all, the number of magazines of this nature that could publish a young teenager today have gone down dramatically, largely because, don't forget, in those days, TV wasn't widespread. Delhi was the only place in the country which had TV. So people, to divert themselves after a day's work or putting up their feet or whatever to amuse themselves, couldn't just go press a remote control. They had to pick up something and engage with it. It was either magazines or books. And therefore, I took writing seriously, and those habits got entrenched. And now for me, when I have something to say, even though thanks to people like you and events like this, I can say it orally and be heard, my normal instinct is to sit down and write an article for a newspaper or a website or a magazine or whatever. That's simply the way in which I've conditioned myself to expressing myself.
In fact, Dr. Tharoor, for somebody who's as erudite as you are, somebody who is kind of, your book is loaded with aha moments and insights. It almost kind of gives you the ability to look into the future of politics. You can actually look at an event and start almost sort of predicting how it's kind of going to shape up. And when you actually see this whole kind of rough and tumble of politics here, and as you kind of try and correlate it with all the kind of knowledge that you have had in terms of your assessment of what this whole kind of battle of belonging is, does it kind of create a certain amount of discord within you, a certain sense of frustration within you, because you can kind of get that overall picture, and then you see all of those symptoms or manifestations of what you have seen, what you can foretell, the trajectories that they will follow? Does it kind of lead to a certain sense of frustration in you that I can almost see how this is going to turn out to be, and yet there is not much that you can do about it? There is something that you want to do about it, but you do not know how you can do something about it. Does that lead to a certain sense of frustration? I'm asking that because you got into politics from the background that you had. Do you get a sense of belonging in Indian politics at this point in time, or do you continue to feel that you're an outsider? Because a lot of people have said that you are a misfit in Indian politics.
Oh yeah, there was even a magazine cover with that title. Now let me say, look, I am an incorrigible optimist, but I define optimism as regarding the future with uncertainty. A pessimist says basically, look, everything is bound to go bad, we're going to fail, it's going to be a disaster, we're doomed. And an optimist says, listen, it can go right, provided we do the right things, we do this and this and this and this, we might be able to change it for the future. So the reason I'm in politics is because I believe that if good people commit themselves, their energies, their mind, their intellect, their time, that they might be able to move the needle in the right direction. Now, very clearly, that logic is looking very, very, shall we say, sparse for someone like me of a liberal democratic mindset, because it is very much illiberal majoritarian thinking that is in the ascendant in our country today. And people like me have every reason to fear or to feel that we are out of it, that really we are being more and more consigned to the margins of our politics. And even if we can foretell disaster coming from some of these developments in the country, that at the end of the day, this is something we are not going to be capable of stopping. I still feel I should plug away. I should continue making this case, argue for it, write about it, and so on. I fully accept that the day will come when I'll say, listen, I've done my bit, let somebody else try if they want to. I just can't deal with it anymore. And the fact is that that I, at this stage, have not yet given up, but I fully recognize that political history is littered with people whose careers have been an exercise in futility. And therefore one has to ask oneself, why should I continue doing this? Wouldn't it be so much nicer to chuck it all up, live in some comfortable place in a good climate instead of the air pollution of Delhi, by the way, and travel and see the world and watch cricket to my heart's content and have a good time, and not worry so much about what happens to India, let it be somebody else's problem. Well, somehow in my life, I've never been able to feel that way. I've never felt India is somebody else's problem, even while working for the UN, even while working, while living abroad, even when being offered their foreign passport. I cared passionately. I once gave an interview about 1990, I think it was, soon after publication of my book, The Great Indian Novel. And I said, India matters to me, and I'd like to matter to India. And that's been quoted back at me a lot as if I meant it in a very pompous way. I didn't, at that time, certainly, I had no intention or prospect of coming into Indian politics. I don't come from a political family. I don't have any political godfather or godmother. I had no patronage. I had no reason to expect that the closed world of Indian politics would offer an opportunity to someone like me. But I said it because I felt that at least let my writings matter. Let me influence minds. Let me influence feelings. Both my fiction and my nonfiction were an exercise in doing that. And at the end of the day, because I have that extra string to my bow, I will work away at politics, but whatever I can't achieve in politics will, I hope, remain between the covers of a book and can still be discovered by future generations that might be able to fight the battles that I have lost. If I lose them, I still believe I could still win some of them in the years ahead.
Dr. Tharoor, you take nationalism as the central concept in this book. It's the battle of belonging. And then you talk about various types of nationalism. There are these 9 types of nationalism that you talk about. You talk about the past of nationalism, how it started building up. You talk about the Middle Ages. You talk about it kind of entering the modern world. You talk about the present times. You go a little bit into the future of nationalism as well. But as you talk about these 9 types of nationalism, the question that comes to mind is that something that you have repeatedly mentioned throughout your book is the ebb and flow of nationalism, how it goes in one direction. It's like a shape-shifting amoeba-like organism as it kind of moves around. And yet the sense that one also gets is that you are trying to drive it in a certain manner, in a certain direction, in a certain trajectory. But the sense that one gets in your book is that it goes in so many different directions, depending upon your location, depending upon your temporal location. So it kind of moves in so many directions. How do you kind of then finally, through this whole kind of chaos of nationalism, define a trajectory that you align with and then see it moving forward? And if you kind of see this whole chaos, why do you then also worry about the fact that certain things are happening? Isn't it just a manifestation of that same amoeba-like organism that it's going to be shape-shifting constantly? It's never, ever going to settle down. But how do you still define a trajectory in this? How do you kind of settle around it?
Thank you, Jyoti. Well, since you've read the book, you know that I do align with one particular position, and that is civic nationalism, which is the nationalist sentiment that derives from the consent of citizens to participate in a free and democratic society. That's the nationalism I identify with, none of the other 9 types. And it's based around the core tenets of representative democracy, freedom of expression, liberal constitutionalism, and so on. And it's voluntary. We choose to participate in our civic society. Whereas ethnic nationalism ties together people of a common ancestry, religion, cultural, linguistic, and other factors, which is what Hindutva is all about. But to my mind, that's a very dangerous ideology in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual country like ours. Our civic nationalism is what's guaranteed by our proudly secular constitution, which outlines the central position of representative democracy and liberal institutions in our society. So I'm arguing in my book that it's crucial that this brand of nationalism, which also happens to be the best to safeguard individual rights, is promoted and protected above all others. Now, when you say that, how does it matter, this ongoing battle? Well, I would argue that it was Mahatma Gandhi's, Nehru's, Dr. Ambedkar's principles which talked about the importance of the acceptance of difference amongst people of different heritage. And that we have tended to summarize in the word secularism, which is not strictly the right word, because the dictionary talks about secularism as being an absence of religion, whereas in India, secularism actually seems to involve a profusion of religions and everyone is encouraged and allowed to flourish. But anyway, that's what's gone into our constitution. And Hindutva is a purely political ideology. It's nothing to do with Hinduism as a religion. I think it's an ideology that's appropriating the Hindu religion to bigoted ends. Now, when you look at our country, and you have the government discrediting every criticism of it as anti-national, you have to understand what it's all about. It's an effort to delegitimize any disagreement with the government as somehow being against the nation. Now, if you belong to an inclusive, open, and democratic country, then to call people anti-national grants the government a monopoly over the idea of the nation, grants them the right to reject any sort of dissent. Why on earth would you, as a Democrat, agree with that? Criticizing our elected leaders or offering alternative paths forward for the country is not unpatriotic nor anti-national. On the contrary, for a patriot, it's one's duty to speak up when one observes injustice, for that's the only way that a country's ills can be rectified. Belonging to a country, which is what my book's title talks about, carries with it the moral obligation to try and better the lives of your fellow citizens. So declaring there's only one correct way of viewing your country actually goes against the spirit of this national responsibility. I talk about patriotism with a lot of affection, as you know. I say that that basically patriotism is like your love for your mother. It's the fact that you love your country because it's yours and because it belongs to you and you belong to it. That idea is what patriotism to me is all about. But patriotism is supporting your country all the time, but your government only when it deserves it. To my mind, disagreeing with the government goes wrong. Disagreeing when the government goes wrong, I beg your pardon, is not only not anti-national, it's actually the highest form of patriotism. That's my argument.
Dr. Tharoor, I would have liked to ask you another 100 questions because I'm like loaded with questions right now, having gone through your book. But as they say, that when you're having a good time, time starts actually moving faster, and we have already reached 4:47 and we are moving towards our hard stop. And we got a number of questions also from the audience here. So I'll quickly kind of start taking up questions, and maybe you could kind of weave in a couple of other concepts and thoughts there. One thing which I definitely would have wanted to ask you is, how do you see the future play out? But if there is a question that is relevant to it, you could probably weave that in there. But let me kind of just quickly go through the questions that we have. And in the meantime, if there are any more questions, type away because I'll just take them quickly. So Amrita, in fact, is kind of talking about your vocabulary and your kind of command over it, and asking that, what is a suggestion that you would give to children to improve their vocabulary for the SAT?
Well, I hope my answer will satisfy Mr. Mohit Batra of the Rajat Book Corner, because I want to urge people to read. Go to places like that, buy books, borrow books, read as much as you can. It's the best advice I can give. In fact, I actually was asked at a high school audience to teach children a new word. I said, let me teach you an old word instead. And that old word is read, because ultimately that's the best way you can acquire all the other words. You won't need to ask me to teach you one.
Anika is asking that when you wrote your first book, what exactly motivated you? What was the motivating force behind the first book that you wrote?
Well, actually, the first book was merely my PhD thesis rehashed. So I did a PhD in Indian politics. It was about the academic concept of something called political development. It was political development and the making of Indian foreign policy. So once a PhD was granted, I said, having done all this work, let's make a book out of it. So I offered it to about the only Indian publisher in those days, way back in 1981 in English, was a publisher called Vikas, which published serious books as well as semi-popular books. I wouldn't really say popular books. There was, I think in those days, Jagco used to publish paperbacks, but otherwise it was Vikas. So, and Vikas liked it and wanted to publish it. So it's my PhD thesis minus some of the heavy academic jargon and theorizing, but just a good narrative about how Indian foreign policy was made in the years up to 1977. That was published in 1981. But if Manika meant my first general book, that was The Great Indian Novel. And that's because I had just turned 30 and gone through this existential crisis. What have I achieved in life, you know? Because for me, writing was so important that all I'd done was write so many articles, short stories, book reviews in a series of newspapers and magazines, which would have been taken out when the week's Radhi is taken out. So I said, what have I written that will last? And I said, I've got to try and write a book that will be read by the general public, not just the foreign policy book that was read by 5,000 people, at least according to the publisher's figures. So I said, let me write something a little more serious, a little more popular as well as substantive. And I happened to be reading Professor Lal's transcreation of the Mahabharata at the time. And I thought, what a wonderful story this is. For 800 years, Indians were telling and retelling the story of the Mahabharata. Why did we stop doing so? I said, imagine if we in the 20th century, this is 1986, 87, if we started retelling the story again, what story would we tell? Because in those days, every major event of their times was interpolated into a retelling of the Mahabharata. So I said, let's try and imagine this. And then I had this idea of imagining Ved Vyas as a retired nationalist politician in his dotage and in his anecdotage, recounting the story of his life and of 20th century India in the process. So I grafted the main characters, episodes, ideas, and philosophies from the Mahabharata, including the Gita, into a retelling of the nationalist movement and the freedom struggle in the 20th century. And because Maha means great and Bharat is India, I called it the Great Indian Novel. It was satirical, it was humorous, it was written with occasional bursting into verse and light verse at that. And of course, it was a huge success. It won various awards. It's probably my one book of which I can proudly say that a new generation has discovered it. When I see young people come up to me clutching copies of the latest reprint of it, asking for my signature, and they are kids who weren't born when the book was first published in 1989, I really feel a tremendous surge of satisfaction that all that energy, idealism, hope, and uncertainty that I put into that book, saying everything I wanted to say about India in that novel, that still finds readers today is very gratifying.
Dr. Tharoor, Bhavika wants to know that we all are Indians, but how does one figure out who is more Indian than others? Who is more Indian than others?
The answer is very simple. No one is more Indian than others. Everyone. You and I are no more Indian than a tribal in Jharkhand or a Kashmiri or a Meghalaya person in the hills of the Garo Hills or the Khasi Hills. We are all Indians. We are all equal. And I totally reject the notion. You got that lovely phrase from Animal Farm when George Orwell writes about the revolution. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It's a brilliant and clever witticism. But that's exactly what the Hindutva movement is suggesting about Hindus in India, and I reject that utterly.
Mega, in fact, makes an observation and says that I loved Enid Blyton and her world of magic, but unfortunately, their charm seems to have worn off the new generation. They have
that's normal. That's normal, Mega, because the truth is that a lot of those stories speak to a sensibility and a world of another generation. I would say that it's only natural that for a new generation, new ideas, new stories, new frames of reference should come up. I actually, when my children were small, Harry Potter had just come out, and I read one or two Harry Potters before, in order to understand what my children were wanting to read. And I thought they were delightful and charming and just as well written or as compellingly readable as Enid Blyton. And at the same time, they were, to my mind, in many ways, a sort of more modern sensibility than some of the attitudes of Enid Blyton, even though they were writing about a world that didn't exist, a world of wizards and muggles and all of that. So I think it's normal. There will be new writers and new stories to tell. There always should be.
In fact, Abbas Dalmi also wants to figure out that would be glad if he can kind of figure out what your views are on the current political scenario in the country, and are we going to see a non-BJP government in the next decade?
Well, I've partly answered that in responding to Jyoti Kamal. One is that first of all, I am an opposition MP. I'm very critical of the present government. And a number of my recent books, India Shastra, which was published 6 months after Mr. Modi came to power, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, which is an analysis of his first term, and now The Battle of Belonging, all of these deal extensively with the specific challenges, political challenges that we are confronting with the rise of the BJP in its present form. And therefore, I would certainly urge you all to read any and ideally all of those 3 books to get my detailed answers. But as you can imagine, I do believe it's very dangerous that this government is not only trying to run politics in a very different way, but in my view is also actually attempting to change the very character and nature of the Indian nation. And that's why it needs to be resisted. Are we going to see a non-BJP government in the next decade, Abhas? Well, the answer, I would say, depends on all of you. Are you in a position to vote with confidence and with shall we say, conviction against the present government? So many people seem to settle for it because they're inundated with messages on WhatsApp that they half believe, or they're prepared to believe more than half of, and they say, well, these guys are so good and they're doing so much. My answer is look around you. Look at the fact that our economy has never been in worse shape since independence. Look at the fact that when the rest of the world has been growing by anything from 2 to 8%, China is growing at 8%. Even during the pandemic, India is the only major economy to have actually suffered negative growth, and we are minus 10.6 in the last fiscal year. Look at the fact that unemployment figures are at record levels. Look at the fact that that when the companies are leaving China because of the rising costs in China and the political misbehavior of China, they're going to Vietnam, they're going to Indonesia, they're not coming to India. Let's look at the fact that the border situation with China remains tense and was mismanaged. The Prime Minister even tried to put a wool over our eyes by claiming that none of our territory was taken, which of course has now been revealed to be wrong. If you look at all of these things, you see a very sorry picture in the country. So if people say this government has failed, then they should certainly vote for a non-BJP alternative. Even if it turns out to be a coalition of very many parties, which is what many people say they don't want to see, the truth is it's better than a government of such incompetence. Many people will say that even if they say the United Front governments of the mid-90s were a dog's breakfast, they produced some of the best budgets that businessmen have ever seen in this country. So I think that a non-BJP government being elected next time will both give us better results, but also teach the BJP a valuable lesson that they cannot keep on abusing the public and taking them for granted to propaganda. They really have to deliver results, and they failed to do so.
Dr. Tharoor, Mohit Batra wants to figure out, how do we indulge the digitally drowned generation into books and readings?
It's tough, but first of all, I think you as parents have to set the example. If your children don't see you sitting down with a book and reading, they'll ask themselves, why should we bother? Dad doesn't want to do it, mom doesn't want to do it, why should I do it? That's very, very common. So in most families where reading is an inculcated family habit, the children will pick it up and follow it. It's happened with my kids. And I'm proud to say that now I'm a grandfather, and my only grandchild loves books because he sees his parents reading all the time, and reading to him as well, which is one more thing you can do. But the second thing, if you believe in that kind of parenthood, which I didn't, is you can ration their television time or their computer time. I didn't. Unfortunately, I never needed to. My children, of their own volition, chose, I'm glad to say, the right mixture of activities. And between reading on the one hand and physical activity and sport on the other, and finally television entertainment and eventually Nintendo and PlayStation and computers, they managed to find a balance. So to this day, I can't take a flight with either of my kids without seeing a book in their hands. They will not just sit in a flight and listen to music or watch a movie. They will prefer to read a book. And I think that if you feel that you can't encourage your kids to feel that way, you could actually help being strict with them and saying, sorry, you get 1 hour of TV every day and that's it. Choose what you want to watch in that 1 hour, but I'm turning off the TV and you're not going to be allowed there into the TV room. Take a book and go. Of course, if they have a mobile phone in their hands, you may not be able to prevent that. But I mean, these are some of the things that you could do. But I think encouraging it and discouraging the alternative have always been the time-honored ways of all parents.
Dr. Tharoor, we are 30 seconds away from the hard stop that had been defined, but here's a question from Anushka, and it's for you to take it as best as you can. How has the idea of India changed for you over the years, born in India to a young diplomat in UN to a seasoned politician? And maybe if you could kind of extrapolate from there, how do you kind of look at the future? I mean, you said you're an optimist, but how do you see the future? How do you see it shaping up? There's something that you mentioned in your book. There are 9 trends, political trends that you identify, and which in a way answers almost everything that you yourself ask, and then you answer through those 9 trends, which kind of explains the situation as it is. And those trends seem to be pretty sound and strong trends. But nonetheless, I mean, going back to Anushka's question, how has the idea of India changed for you, and how do you kind of see it going?
Okay, well, not born in India, but grew up in India. In any case, I moved to India when I was 2.5, so I wasn't exactly having a formed idea of India in my head. But I grew up in India, and the India I grew up in was a very cosmopolitan India. It was, of course, the India of 60s Bombay, where, and my father being a product of a nationalist generation, he had dropped his caste surname so that, you know, he felt with Mahatma Gandhi that caste was a bad thing. And never in all my years of growing up was the caste or religion of any of the numerous friends who would come home, attend my birthday parties and play with me ever mentioned. So I had no sense. I had friends. Later, I realized as I became aware of these things that my friends had included Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Parsis, and various kinds of each, actually. And in fact, if I ever thought of my friend Mammu Kanga as being a minority, because he's actually Muhammad Kanga and a Muslim, the only minority I thought of him as is being the minority of the very rich, because he had the first cassette player in his father's Fiat car in Bombay in 1965 or something. So, you know, that was the kind of thinking. We judged people by who they were and other attributes, never their religion, their caste, anything they were born with. And so my idea of India was always anchored in that idea. It was certainly also the idea encouraged by the official establishment of that time. National integration was a cliche of those days. Everyone talked about national integration. You know, entertainment tax used to be waived in the movie theaters on movies that promoted coexistence amongst communities. I don't know how many of you remember a movie called Amar Akbar Antony, where 3 kids are separated, 3 brothers as toddlers, and one's brought up as a Muslim, one's brought up as a Christian, one's brought up as a Hindu, and they all come together in the course of the movie and they fight the bad guys. Now that movie was, for example, relieved of having to pay entertainment tax. So it was actually cheaper for you to see that movie than to see a regular commercial movie, because a regular commercial movie, this is also a commercial movie, but because the theme was national integration as the government saw it, it was cheaper for you to go, so more people went, and as a result, the message went up. That was the kind of officially promoted culture. Today, our officially promoted culture is one of bigotry, of intolerance, of being told that a particular minority is pampered and appeased and spoiled, and that we should deny them rights, and it's our country and not theirs, and all of this kind of talk, which I find personally quite revolting. So I have to say that to my mind, my idea of India has never changed or hasn't evolved. I would only say that when I was abroad, perhaps I saw the big picture much more. When I'm back in India, I see the nitty-gritty details. I have to go and campaign in my constituency and win votes in my constituency. I've won 3 times. So I deal with, on a daily basis, with the prejudices and passions of Indians there. I will say that to my mind, even though the perspective may be from the UN, a big perspective, from the grassroots, a different perspective, at the end of the day, it's the same perspective. India's diversity is a strength. India's cosmopolitanism is an asset, and we should be a country of very many different kinds of people. We should be one. In fact, when I was in America, I would actually in talks say that you Americans consider yourself a melting pot. Well, we are not. We are a thali. We are a collection of different dishes in different bowls. And because they're in different bowls, they don't necessarily flow into one another, but they belong together on the same platter, and they combine on your palate to give you a satisfying meal. That is the metaphor of India, to my mind, the idea of India as a thali. And I don't think that it will at all work for the BJP to try and turn that thali into a khichdi. And that's what they're trying to do.
We, in fact, have questions from Sonal, Vishal, Jagdeep, but since I think we have run out of time, we are 5:04. And I mean, even if we extended this by another hour, I'm sure people would still be left wanting for more. But there is one question that I would like to ask you, because that is something that everybody kept discussing before this kind of thing has finally materialized. And that was all the lady members of EO who were like absolutely excited and thrilled that Dr. Shashi Tharoor is going to be on this panel. And the question that comes to mind is, do you still blush with the kind of attention that you get from all the women that kind of you encounter on and off? Do you still blush, or what is the magic formula that seems to be working and that gets kind of people really kind of this excited about your presence?
Listen, sometimes some women do make me blush, but I have to say most of the time, I just really enjoy being appreciated, just as I appreciate them. And I enjoy engaging with them. I think, honestly, one good advantage perhaps of my upbringing in Bombay, and in a household with 3 strong women, my mother and 2 sisters, I was the only male other than my dad, was a tremendous respect for the abilities and qualities of women, and I'm afraid a willingness to listen to them. So the result is that I would say perhaps the one thing that many of my friends in this country could usefully profit from is that they will get along much better with women if they treat them with respect as equals, and neither as people to be, shall we say, seduced, if that's the word, nor as people to be disparaged or demeaned. They're human beings. Sometimes men tend to forget that. They have the same needs, hopes, aspirations, talents, abilities as you do as a man. And I think if you recognize that and that dominates your interaction, you'll get along very well with women in this country and around the world. A minor tip for those men who might be behaving otherwise.
All right, thank you so much. As they say, all good things come to an end, and it's been absolutely a privilege and an honor to be kind of discussing all of these issues with you. There are a million more questions that we could be kind of asking of you, maybe another time, definitely. Thank you so much for participating here. Bhavika, I'll kind of hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jyoti. You were a terrific interlocutor.
Thank you so much.
Well, before we sum up this candid, riveting session, I would like to share a quote from your book, sir, The Battle of Belonging. And quoting you, sir, while the patriot is prepared to die for his homeland, then a nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. I believe all of us have learned a lot today, and we will all definitely encourage our kids to read as much as they can. On behalf of EO Punjab fraternity and our forum Horizons, I, Bhavika Gupta, extend a vote of thanks to Dr. Shashi Tharoor for enthralling us with such an insightful, thought-provoking interaction and revealing his take on nationalism and patriotism. Also, I extend my gratitude to Mr. Jyoti Kamal, Executive Editor, CNN News 18, for moderating this session seamlessly. In the end, I would also like to mention that this event was curated by an independent bookstore, Rajat Book Corner, just to invigorate the love of reading and reading books and get into them as much as we can. Thank you, everyone, for attending this session and making it a successful one.
Thank you, Bhavika. Thank you, Jyoti.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jyoti.
All the best. Thank you, Jai Hind.
Thank you for watching this video. If you also love conversations at a bookstore, please do subscribe and like this channel. And if you wish to host your favorite author over a chat, do mention the same in the comment box and witness magic happen. Please also visit our website www.rajatbookcorner. This is Mohit Batras signing off.